Hello and welcome back to Hypatia's Lantern. This week we're going to talk about free speech. It's a hotly contested issue, often treading on multiple ethical dilemmas, political rights and questions over the nature and extent of what we say and do. This is obviously like everything I love to talk about, full of nuance and varying shades of colour. There is very little space for an unequivocal stance on this topic, and I hope, like always, you come to your own conclusions from the arguments and points that I bring forward. Free speech. A broad definition is the right to freely speak without limitation or suppression. But even that definition has its issues, because nowhere on the planet is that true, not even in countries where the right to free speech is protected by either standard law or constitutional right. There has, since time immemorial, existed limitations on what humans can say or write. This is not a new debate, it is one of the oldest in history. To those on the right wing, the SJWs are coming for not only your guns, but also your right to speak, your right to offend, your right to say as you please. It's a catchy tagline, and it sells very well. And yet, does it address what the concerns around free speech actually are? This is not so much a dunk as a discussion. There are extents to be discussed and practical limitations to consider. The base premise of the right at the moment is that free speech is being stifled and there is a group mind narrative being built and dissension is no longer tolerated. Is this true? Like with all things, to a point some parts are true and some parts are not. We frequently hear the quote oft attributed to Voltaire, "I despise what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." How far does that extend? How reasonable is it to accept that standard in our modern world? One of the most toxic debates going on right now that ties into free speech is the argument around trans rights. Let me preface this point by saying that I wholeheartedly support the push for equal treatment by trans people and recognition as their self rather than their assigned gender at birth. Those that argue against trans rights are often called TERFs, or trans exclusionary radical feminists, who deliberately, disingenuously construct their points on bad science, poor understanding of the issues, and a deliberate attempt to misconstrue the situation. However, you have some people who, while supporting trans rights, come under fire for expressing some concerns over implementation, often in poorly thought out ways. The concerns are expressed in a good faith argument and are not deliberately set out to harm. Some of these concerns are expressed as a result of myths spread by TERFs on the issue of self-ID or shared bathrooms, though others are rational concerns. We must be mindful of the fact that accepting the premise of self-ID isn't the same as implementing that into law, and there are practical issues that need to be addressed. Often this group of people are jumped on and labelled TERFs even when the basis of their issue isn't at all to do with the validity of trans people, which they do not deny. This is not unique to trans rights, just that it is one of the clearest demonstrations of this point at this current time. It applies to many other movements and ideas. It comes from left and right, from being shouted down as a Tory for refusal to accept hand-waving on Scottish independence, to being called a traitor by Brexiters, to TERFs themselves shouting down people who are attempting to understand their concerns while still accepting that trans men are men and trans women are women. The right frequently likes to highlight such instances as the intolerant left, despite doing the exact same thing, often to a worse degree, shouting shrilly to decry those who violate social standards of politeness or dignity towards their chosen group. One of the greatest examples of this hypocrisy was the outrage directed to Hillary Clinton for her remark of Donald Trump collecting a basket of deplorables. Whilst when Trump made a racist or sexist remark, people are snowflakes for demanding an apology or retraction. This from the same people who blasted Barack Obama for wearing a tan suit. Isolated? No. Talk about Ronald Reagan's actual record as president, or talk about the systemic issues with the concept of the thin blue line, or even just express support for kneeling during the US national anthem or during a Premier League football game, and you see people react harshly, viscerally for expressing your opinion. is this also not limiting free speech? When the right talks about free speech, they're talking about a very specific form of free speech, the right to offend, and solely their right to offend at that. They believe that it is perfectly okay for them to walk into a theatre full of leftist students and talk about how trans women are men in drag, and so on. And yes, legally that speech is protected. They can express that speech without persecution from the government. What they don't have is a right to a platform upon which to spread that speech, and this is where so many don't seem to understand what free speech is. There is a difference between being free from persecution by the government for speaking your mind and people or organisations choosing to not offer their space or time to allow you to speak, especially if your speech is hostile towards the majority of their audience or market. Just as you have the freedom to speak, others have the freedom to not listen to your speech. A nice pithy line, of course, but let us talk more about that right to offend. The right to offend is vital in a free society. It's a horrific thing to deliberately go out to offend people. From a moral standpoint, it's fundamentally wrong, I feel, to go out to cause pain, and yet it is one of our most important rights. Now, I'm not talking in abstract here. Put yourself in a position where you strongly, vehemently feel like something should not be said, and someone says it to you. You'd be enraged, wouldn't you? You'd feel disrespected and outraged that somebody would dare to be so rude, so outrageously offensive. And that is a perfectly normal human reaction. But then add into the mix the need, the necessity to be able to offend, to challenge. Most frequently, one of the main fault lines is on religion. Islam is often singled out for this, but truthfully, all religions do it. You would only need to say that the God of the Old Testament is cruel to get most Christians in the US going, or say something offensive about Lord Ram to a Hindu. The problem is that religion is a value system that brings the spiritual into the temporal, and for most of recorded history, religion has governed our lives and ruled what is and is not permissible, and it has often done so with an iron fist. Almost always, this has taken a conservative bent to preserve the power of a priestly class and limit the progression of rights towards others. This nearly always includes preserving the empowered religion as the sole source of the divine's word on earth. How does this fit into the right to free speech? Simple. The right to dissent. The right to say, hold on, I do not believe, I do not agree, I do not conform. And that is why it is so important, and why the right to offend is so important. Most religious people, particularly in the era where religion was dominant, would be outraged by promiscuity or arguing that the divine does not need to be at the very centre of a person's existence. This isn't something new. One of the charges against Socrates was that he was being impious. This freedom of speech and right to offend has driven social thinking from beyond traditional morality dictated by religious orders to a new form of morality, where we focus not on whether something is religious or not, but whether something is just or not. We have moved from theology towards ethics. But how far does this right to speech stretch? We've touched in previous discussions on gaps in freedom of speech. One such gap that is frequently exploited by fascists is where fascists hold protests or marches through minority neighbourhoods and areas as a deliberate means of provoking violence. This tactic, as we've discussed, has been used by Nazis in Weimar Germany and more recently white nationalists in the United States and the English Defence League in the United Kingdom. These marches are protected by the police, who protect these racists from an outraged community who do not want these people chanting about exterminating them within meters of their own home, their families and their children. This gap exists and has been continually exploited for propaganda purposes. It is intended as either a show of strength if the march goes ahead unopposed, or as, when it usually does, results in violence, as a demonstration that those animals who live here need to be put on planes or boats and deported. This is exactly what happened in the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, where the British Union of Fascists, protected by the police, attempted to march through the east of London, which at that time had a large Jewish population. The local populace and political activists put up barricades and attempted to prevent the fascists from marching through. It led to a clash between activists, the police, and the fascists, and eventually the fascists were turned back. It's a celebrated moment in the fight against fascism in the United Kingdom. Another issue with the right to offend is that there are people who use this right not as a defense of ideas, but as a way to harass and harm people. As many people point out, it isn't okay to use your speech to continually assault a person's experiences or them personally. Included within this is a consistent refusal to use a person's chosen pronouns. Gender dysphoria is no joke, and misgendering someone deliberately is a denial of them as a person, and it can contribute to an often already fragile mental state. Furthermore, this isn't a casual choice. It is done deliberately as a way to signal that they have the power, that they are refusing to see a person as they are, but instead what they choose to believe that person is. And let me be clear, most people won't react to accidentally using the wrong pronoun, but people will react to continually using the wrong pronoun. By our understanding of freedom of speech, people are perfectly entitled to use the wrong pronoun, despite our acceptance of the idea that people should not harm others in society. It is, of course, wrong to do this, but is it right to police this? I don't know. It's a difficult line to argue on, because free speech is one of the few places where the slippery slope argument is not only appropriate, but rational. The current way to combat these people is to no platform them, but that brings its own issues. No platforming is a recognition that whilst people are free to say as they please within the law, they are not free to be given a platform upon which to do so. No platformers have successfully helped drive neo-Nazi leaders such as Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos into the ground. And we are also seeing no platforming expanded elsewhere. To my mind, no platforming is the last line of defence. It is not something to be used at the drop of a hat or something to be deployed immediately when someone disagrees, nor is it appropriate to be used against traditional conservative viewpoints which are valid even if we are to disagree. Don't get me wrong here, I don't agree with almost any conservative viewpoint, but the vast majority of traditional viewpoints are rooted in a good faith political argument. They are not the same as neo-Nazi talking points, and that I think is the dividing line. Another frequent issue around free speech is this concept of checking one's privilege. I'm a man. Am I able to speak on women's issues? Yes and no. I'm a feminist. I spent a lot of time listening and learning from women who describe their direct lived experiences. This was part of my studies at university, and I have continued to read into the empirical evidence that backs up a lot of these lived experiences. My understanding is, however, coloured by the fact that I will, likely as not, never experience almost any of these situations firsthand. Is it therefore appropriate, for example, for me to debate someone on the right to abortion? Yes, it is. I can bring to the fore arguments, evidence and ideas that will back up my points, that will show the nuance and attempt to build common ground. To those colloquially known as Tumblr feminists, this is probably something outrageous. However, it isn't that only those of a particular group or identity are able to speak on an issue. It's recognising that sometimes those who aren't part of that group are unable to understand how or why an issue exists. It is, to use another popular situation, when a white person tries to explain to a black person in the United States why something isn't racist or why they're overreacting, even though they have no idea what they're talking about. Despite the understanding of the issue, we have to recognise that sometimes lived experience is something that gives greater insight than a casual reading or even just a popular understanding. That is why, whenever I discuss anything that touches on the lived experience of others, I always try to check back and make sure what I am saying can at the very least be evidenced. Is this misused by woke people? Yes, it is. I think there is a subset of people who are colloquially referred to as woke, who try to do the right thing, but in doing so, simply manage to make things worse. Sometimes it sounds like a lack of intellectual humility, other times obnoxiousness, and sometimes just a good faith attempt to make things better. It's not an easy line to draw. I won't say that I've never made a mistake or that I haven't put my foot in it, because I have, plenty of times, as many people who know me can attest to. I'm human, or at least I like to think so. I make mistakes. The important thing is recognizing when someone is telling you that you've made a mistake and being able to use your judgment and your humility to try and understand what the issue is. It's also really important that dominant groups don't try to speak past marginalized groups. If you're a white person and taking control of a discussion on racism over the speech of minority activists, nearly always there's a problem there. Unless you can bring years of quantifiable research, you're going to be on very unsound footing. I'm going to pause there for this week. Part 2 will be out next Saturday, barring any issues, and we'll go further into this concept of wokeness, talk about safe spaces, and expand more on the very idea of freedom of speech. I want to thank you all for listening, and I'd love to see your ideas and thoughts expressed in the comment section. Thank you again, and goodbye.